My name is Richard. I'm 54 years old, and I've spent half my life building an empire in complete silence, learning that real authority never needs to shout to be respected. Yet just a few weeks ago, I found myself sitting at a lavish dining table, holding a cheap plastic cup and wearing an old shirt I had pulled from the back of a forgotten closet, while my son-in-law's family looked at me the way one looks at an insect crawling across an expensive carpet. It was at that exact moment, while the boy's father bragged loudly about his supposed connections, that I overheard his wife whisper that my daughter was a low-class social climber, useful only for improving their son's family name. They called me ignorant. They mocked my supposed lack of education. They treated me like an inconvenience they had to tolerate out of obligation, never imagining that the man they despised for his appearance was the very one signing the checks for the multinational corporation quietly supporting their painfully mediocre lifestyles. Arrogance is a poison that blinds fools, and they drank every drop without realizing I was already timing their downfall. That night, as I pretended to wipe a grease stain from my worn-out pants, I made a decision. I wouldn't just strip them of their pride, I would erase them completely from the world of people who matter. If you enjoy stories where betrayal has consequences and justice arrives without warning, leave your like and subscribe. Here we share real stories of revenge and lessons that are never forgotten. To understand how I ended up at that table, you need to understand who I really am. I am not the man they thought they saw. For the past 30 years, I built my life on raw effort and a level of discipline few people can endure. I started at the very bottom, loading boxes in freezing warehouses where the cold cut straight to the bone, saving every single dollar while my friends wasted their paychecks on parties and appearances. My success wasn't luck. It was a carefully engineered structure of real estate investments and logistics businesses. And yet I always kept a low profile. I never cared for gold watches or flashy cars that announce your arrival before you step out of them. I prefer discretion. My daughter Eleanor grew up watching that effort. She always had a noble heart, too noble perhaps. She fell in love with a man named Julian, a young guy who at first glance seemed hard-working and honest, but who came attached to a family that breathed an arrogance they never truly earned. They knew nothing about my wealth. When Elena told me she was getting married, she asked me for an unusual favor. She wanted Julian's family to meet me as I truly was in essence, not as a man defined by numbers in a bank account. She feared that if they knew the truth about my fortune, the relationship would be poisoned by interest and calculation. I agreed. It sounded like an interesting experiment, a trial by fire for my future in-laws. So on the day of the first formal dinner, I decided to play the role of a hard-working father, a retired country man with rough hands and clothes bought at discount markets. I wanted to see whether their respect was directed at the human being or at the wallet. Elena was nervous. I was calm. I was used to negotiating with sharks, so dealing with a middle-class family pretending to be aristocracy didn't feel like much of a challenge. I arrived at their house, a pretentious property burdened by a mortgage that, as I later learned, kept them awake at night. The atmosphere was thick with a cheap fragrance of superiority. Julian's father, a man named Robert, greeted me with a weak handshake and a glance that scanned my worn-out shoes from top to bottom in less than a second. His wife, Beatrice, didn't even bother standing up. She waved her hand vaguely, as if brushing away a fly. During the first hour, the air felt heavy. They talked about their trips, their so-called connections in government, and how important it was to maintain status in modern times. I simply nodded, ate with slightly awkward manners, and spoke only when absolutely necessary. I watched my daughter. She tried to bridge the two worlds, but the gap was obvious. Julian, on the other hand, seemed embarrassed by my presence. He didn't defend me. He didn't look me in the eyes. He just laughed along with his father's mediocre jokes about people without ambition. That was when the balance began to crack. I didn't feel hurt. I felt a cold curiosity. It was like observing a laboratory experiment. I wanted to see how far the rot in their character would go. The emotional status of that room was silent tension from Elena and absolute condescension from them. They felt safe. They believed they were in control because they owned branded dinnerware while I had trimmed nails and weathered skin. They asked what I did for a living. I told them I handled property repairs and managed some deliveries. In their limited minds, that meant I was a construction worker or a delivery driver. Beatrice's expression turned into something close to comic disgust. She covered her mouth with a silk napkin and looked at her son as if to say, "You seriously brought this to our table?" I kept eating my steak, which, by the way, was overcooked, my eyes lowered, my ears sharp, catching every whisper and every sigh of contempt. In that moment, I was the man any of you could be. A humble father who only wants his daughter's happiness, facing the prejudice of people who believe they're worth more because of what they appear to have, rather than who they truly are. The difference was simple. I had an ace up my sleeve they couldn't even imagine, and I was mentally recording every insult, every gesture of exclusion, preparing myself for the moment when the mask would have to fall, not to ask for forgiveness, but to carry out a sentence that was already written in my mind. The dinner went on, and with it, the last traces of that family's mask of decency completely collapsed. What had started as passive condescension quickly turned into open, deliberate cruelty. Beatrice, Julian's mother, stopped pretending I didn't exist and decided I would be the night's entertainment. She leaned forward, gently swirling her wine glass with rehearsed elegance, and asked me, her voice dripping with poison, whether I had ever eaten at a restaurant where you didn't have to order your food through a microphone from your car. Robert let out a dry laugh, while Julian, the man who supposedly loved my daughter, lowered his head and smiled in agreement. There was no defense. No, "That's enough, Mom." Just silence, and a betrayal that landed like a physical blow to my daughter's chest. Elena tried to change the subject, talking about future plans, but Robert cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. He said that future plans depended on the quality of one's allies, and that unfortunately, her family seemed to offer nothing more than an aesthetic burden they would have to hide at social events within their circle. That was when the atmosphere turned icy. Beatrice leaned toward her son, and in what she intended to be a private whisper, but was perfectly audible to everyone, delivered the sentence that sealed their fate. "It's a shame, Julian, that you have to carry this dead weight. She's pretty, but she has servant genes, and that man she calls a father is a constant reminder of the misery she comes from." I felt the rage rise up my throat like acid, but I didn't move. My hands stayed still on the table, fingers interlaced in a calm that might have looked like submission to an inexperienced observer. But to anyone who truly knew me, it was the signal that the fire had already been lit. I looked at Julian, hoping, at least for a flash of dignity, that he would draw a line. Instead, he looked at his mother and said, "I know, Mum, but don't worry. Richard already understands that his place will be in the kitchen whenever we have important guests." Eleanor stood up, her eyes filled with tears, but Robert's laughter stopped her. He told her to sit down and not be dramatic like people from her class. That night I realized they weren't just insulting me. They were crushing my daughter's self-worth, treating her like an object they had acquired below market value. The contempt in their gestures was absolute. Beatrice complained that the smell of hard work on my clothes was ruining her appetite. Dessert was served to me on a chipped ceramic plate, a deliberate gesture to mark the difference between them and me. Julian even had the audacity to ask me that if I attended the wedding I shouldn't speak to anyone, that I should just stand in a corner and say I was part of the cleaning staff if someone asked. The injustice didn't stop at words. At the end of the dinner, as we were about to leave, Robert pulled me aside into the hallway. He placed a hand on my shoulder, squeezing with unnecessary force, and slipped a wrinkled $50 bill into my palm. He said it was for a taxi, because he didn't want my old noisy truck parked in front of his house any longer. Neighbors might think they were having cheap repairs done. He looked at me with a sense of superiority that bordered on insanity. In that moment, I lost every trace of mercy. I finally saw them for what they were, parasites living off an image that I myself, without knowing it, was quietly sustaining through my indirect investments in the companies where they worked. I walked out of that house under the rain, the cold biting my face, but inside I was nothing but controlled fire. Eleanor cried in the passenger seat, apologizing for bringing me there, for exposing me to that humiliation. I said nothing. I just started the engine and drove in silence. The symbolic expulsion was complete. They had cast me out of their imaginary world. They had degraded me and treated my daughter like trash. 10 minutes later, Julian called her phone, not to apologize, but to complain that his mother was upset because I hadn't thanked them for dinner. Elena turned off the phone. That was the last time she was the victim. From that moment on, the structure of their lives, so solid in their own minds, began to crack under the weight of my next move. They wanted a poor, naive man, and I was going to give them exactly what people deserve when they confuse humility with weakness. For the 3 days following that dinner, I slept no more than 4 hours a night. My mind wasn't clouded by anger, it was sharpened by purpose. My office, a place they couldn't even imagine existed, became the command center for their own demolition. I called my trusted attorney Mark, a man who has buried entire corporations under the weight of their own legal mistakes. I didn't need anything illegal. Reality was far sweeter. I discovered that Robert, Julian's proud father, worked as a supply director at a mid-sized construction company that had just been acquired by one of my investment funds. He didn't know it yet, but his boss was now the man with servant genes. The plan wasn't simply to fire him. That would have been too fast, too merciful. Revenge, when served cold, requires the victim to watch every brick of their castle crumble before the roof collapses on top of them. First, I ordered a deep independent audit of his department. From the way he bragged about his income, I knew Robert was skimming funds or accepting kickbacks from suppliers. Men with that kind of arrogance always leave traces. They believe they're too clever to be caught. Within 48 hours, Mark had proof on his desk that Robert had been inflating construction material budgets for the past 3 years. The weapon was loaded and my finger was on the trigger. Meanwhile, I turned my attention to Beatrice. She loved boasting about her social connections and her exclusive club. What she didn't know was that I was the main donor to the foundation that kept that club alive. With a single call to the board, casually mentioning ethical restructuring, I had her membership placed under review. I didn't expel her immediately. I let her start receiving formal letters requesting clarifications of conduct. I wanted her to feel the fear of being rejected by the only circle that gave meaning to her empty existence. I saw her from a distance one afternoon, leaving a boutique, still walking as if the world owed her something. I smiled to myself. She had no idea that the ground beneath her feet had already turned into quicksand. As for Julian, the fiancé, the blow was more direct. He worked at an insurance brokerage firm that depended almost entirely on contracts from my logistics fleet. I gave the order to cancel the renewal of every single contract with that firm, citing a lack of confidence in the integrity of junior staff. When his boss realized they were losing their largest account because of Julian's reputation, his career stopped cold. He was placed on unpaid leave while they investigated the situation. I watched him unravel on social media, posting old photos to pretend everything was fine, while my daughter, Elena, had already blocked his number and moved back to my country home, far away from his toxicity. My preparation was meticulous. There were no threats, no angry phone calls. Every move was a chess piece sliding across the board, and they were nothing more than wooden pawns. I met with my accounting team and instructed them to purchase the mortgage on Robert's house. As it turned out, his bank was selling off debt portfolios, and I bought his through a shell company. Now I wasn't just the owner of the company where he worked, and the man who controlled his social club. I was, quite literally, the owner of the walls he slept between. I remember sitting on my balcony staring out at the horizon, holding a folder filled with documents that represented the end of their arrogance. I felt a deep sense of peace. Not the satisfaction of a villain, but the calm of a judge about to deliver a necessary sentence. Patience is the virtue of those who know they hold absolute power. Every time I remembered the crumpled $50 bill Robert had handed me, or the way Beatrice had called my daughter a servant, I felt a renewed sense of precision. This was never about money. It was about respect. They had forgotten that respect isn't demanded with words, it's earned through integrity. And integrity was something they didn't have in any of their bank accounts. Everything was ready for the final act. All that was missing was an invitation. A reconciliation dinner, one they would accept out of pure greed, believing that the poor old man wanted to apologize for his behavior. The invitation was delivered through a luxury courier service, printed on stationery that displayed nothing more than the initials of my consortium. I summoned them to the headquarters of my company, a glass and steel building that dominates the city's skyline. In their endless greed, they assumed Elena had finally convinced some important executive to meet with them to save their jobs. They had no idea they were walking straight into the lion's den. When they arrived at reception, I watched them through the security cameras. Robert was wearing his best suit, one he could no longer afford, and Beatrice walked with her chin held high, completely unaware that the security team had been instructed not to let them leave until I was finished. They were escorted into the boardroom, a space with a solid oak table and a breathtaking view of the city. They sat down, nervous but still arrogant, complaining about how long they had been kept waiting. Julian was there too, trying to look professional, though the sweat on his forehead betrayed him. Then I walked in. This time I wasn't wearing the old jacket or the worn shoes. I was dressed in a custom-made three-piece suit, a watch worth more than their house, and the calm gaze of a man who has nothing to lose because he already owns everything. The silence was absolute, the color drained from Robert's face in a way that was almost poetic. Beatrice opened her mouth, but no sound came out, only a strangled gasp. I sat at the head of the table and placed the wrinkled $50 bill right in the center, directly in front of Robert. I didn't say a word for a full minute. I simply looked at them. Silence is the most powerful weapon when the other side knows they're guilty. Finally, I spoke, my voice low, almost a whisper. Robert, you said my truck ruined the look of your street. Interesting, because today I signed the eviction order for your house. It's no longer yours, it's mine. And I'm tearing it down to build a parking lot for my employees. Robert tried to stammer something about a mistake, about an apology, but I raised my hand slightly and he fell silent. I turned to Beatrice. Your genes, Beatrice, are fascinating. You spoke about my daughter as if she were a servant. That's why I personally made sure the club you love showing off at received a recording of your words from that night. You're no longer welcome there. In fact, I doubt you'll be welcome anywhere other than an unemployment line, which, by the way, you won't find easily once your husband's audit becomes public. She began to tremble. Tears of rage and fear streamed down her face, destroying her expensive makeup. Julian tried to intervene, calling me father-in-law in a trembling voice that filled me with disgust. Don't you dare use that word, I said, staring straight into his eyes. You had the chance to be a man and protect the woman you claimed to love. Instead, you chose to be the obedient lapdog of your parents' mediocrity. I cancelled every contract with your firm. Your career in this industry is over before it ever truly began. You are nothing, Julian, a hollow man in a cheap suit. I pulled out a folder containing the audit documents and slid it across the table toward Robert. Here's the proof of your embezzlement. You have two options. You sign the voluntary transfer of all your properties and savings to compensate the company, or this folder reaches the district attorney in 10 minutes. You decide whether you want to sleep on the street or in a cell. Robert broke down. There was nothing left of the man who had looked at me with disgust at that dinner. He collapsed over the table, searching for a pen with shaking hands. He signed every page, surrendering what little dignity and wealth he had left. Beatrice screamed that this was illegal, that it was a trap, but the lawyer standing beside me simply handed her a copy of the bylaws she herself had chosen to ignore. I watched them sink into their own misery, finally realizing that the poor old man was not naive at all, but the architect of their ruin. When they finished signing, I stood up. The guards opened the doors. You may leave now, I said coldly. And Robert, keep the $50. You'll need it for a taxi because there's no car waiting for you outside. I've already had the company vehicle you were using repossessed. I watched them walk down the hallway hunched over, small, defeated by their own poison. I felt no joy, only technical satisfaction, the same feeling you get when a job is done correctly. Justice isn't emotional. Its balance restored. They broke that balance with their arrogance, and I simply applied the necessary weight on the other side of the scale to put everything back where it belonged. After the office doors closed behind them, silence returned to the room, but this time it was a clean silence. There was no trace left of their arrogance or the heavy air that people carry when they believe themselves superior without having built anything of their own. I walked toward the glass wall and watched them leave the building through the main entrance. They looked like small shadows under the afternoon sun, moving with the uncertainty of those who have just discovered that the real world doesn't operate according to their fantasies of status. Robert searched his pockets for something, probably the keys to a car that no longer belonged to him, while Beatrice walked a few steps behind, her shoulders slumped for the first time in her life. Life went on for everyone, but in very different ways. My daughter, Eleanor, went through a necessary process of healing. Seeing Julian's true nature was painful, but it became the catalyst she needed to understand that love without respect is nothing more than a decorated cage. Today she runs one of my foundations, far from the shadow of those who once tried to crush her. As for them, the fall was absolute. Without a house, without jobs, and with a reputation that followed them everywhere they tried to go, they ended up living in a small rented apartment on the outskirts of the city, far from the clubs and appearances they had defended so fiercely. Robert now works as a night security guard, an ironic position for someone who once despised people who wore uniforms. Sometimes people ask me why I went that far. Some call it cruelty. Others say it was an abuse of power. I see it differently. People like them spend their entire lives humiliating those they consider inferior, because they've never encountered a wall they couldn't jump over with a lie or a look of contempt. I wasn't their executioner. I was their reality. I gave them the chance to show their true character in front of a man who offered them nothing material, and they failed the test in the most miserable way possible. There was no reconciliation because there is nothing to reconcile with rot. Some people don't change. They only hide when they lose power. I learned that the greatest form of power is not the one you display, but the one you reserve for moments of justice. I feel no regret for taking everything from them, because in truth, they never owned anything at all. Everything they had was a facade sustained by the goodwill of a system they chose to spit on. Now, whenever I sit at a table with someone new, I remain the same man. Few words, simple gestures, but I always observe. I watch how they treat the waiter. I listen to how they speak about those who have less. I pay attention to how they react to simplicity. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's watching life collect its debts. If this story felt as intense to you as it was for me to live it, leave your like and tell me in the comments what you would have done. And if you're not subscribed yet, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next stories.